columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C. If you'd like to read my columns about the twists and turns in the midterm elections, you can read them at muckrack.com, M-U-C-K-R-A-C-K, muckrack.com /Brad Bannon, /Brad Bannon, /articles. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. Mondays on Deadline DC, I talk to the players and people behind the politics and policies that drive our great nation forward. There are only 8 days until Election Day, and we have two guests to talk about elections today. In the first half hour, our guest is Marcia Johnson-Blanco, who is the co-executive director of the Lawyers Committee Voting Rights Project. Then in the second half hour, our guest will be Dr. Robert Shapiro, the noted economist, who joins us to talk about the impact of the economy on the midterm elections. But our first guest is Marcia Johnson-Blanco, co-director for the Lawyers Committee's Voting Rights Projects. She manages the project's voter engagement programs and the advocacy portfolios, which include the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection coalition, engagement in the Senate census, the redistricting process, researching the history of discrimination in voting, advocating for the restoration of full protections of the Voting Rights Act, and promoting a national and state-based electoral reform legislation that ensures access to the ballot. The website for the Lawyers Committee is lawyerscommittee.org. And the Twitter handle is LawyersComm. Marcia's handle is MFJ Blanco, Blanco, all one word. Marcia, thanks for joining me on Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing all right, getting ready for November 8th.
Yeah, I imagine you're very busy now. Now, this is the way I look at it, Marcia, and I'd like to know what you think. The history of democracy in America has been the slow but steady expansion of voting rights. Back in the founding days of the Republic, the only people who could vote were white men who owned a certain amount of property. We've moved way beyond that now, but my concern is we may be moving backwards. Am I right to be concerned?
You are right to be concerned, but I also think that what we've seen so far in this early voting cycle is that voters are energized. I think there's a difference between what our politicians are doing and what the voters are doing. We've seen in 2020, we had a historic turnout to the vote. And then we saw the backlash to that turnout. We saw in states like Georgia and Texas, where they put constraints on those opportunities that voters used to achieve that historic turnout for partisan ends. But we see that voters are pushing back and hearing that, there are already 20 million people who voted early means, we're on track to have a really great turnout this cycle. But we really need to be vigilant and really hold those politicians to task who are trying to make it harder to vote. And that's the battle we have ahead of us.
Okay. Could you talk about, you raised the issue, could you talk about some of the obstacles that states, yeah, as you said, in record turnout in 2020, which was great. But since then, many states have erected barriers to voting. Could you talk about some of the things that states did to limit voting?
Yeah, so states that had a lot of use of absentee voting in 2020 now make it harder to vote absentee. either by shortening the deadlines to get the absentee ballot, or as in the case in Georgia, requiring a photo ID in order to vote absentee, and particularly if you don't have a state driver's license or a state issued ID, having to make a photocopy of another ID and submit it with your application and with your ballot. Um, Criminalizing support at the polls. We have these states that had incredibly long lines where voters had to wait 5 hours up to 9 hours to vote. And the community came out and offered water and food. And now they've criminalized that activity. You're no longer allowed to support voters who are waiting in line to vote, which is just incredible. And we've also
What's
seen.
wrong with giving food and water to people who are voting? You think we would reward them for going to the time and trouble of voting, and what's the rationale for helping them?
I can't imagine, a reasonable rationale. And here's the thing: the reason people are in these incredibly long lines is because there are not enough voting equipment at polling places. And so you don't make the opportunities available to the voter, and that you punish the voter who's going to stay in line despite that lack of opportunity to be able to go in and vote as quickly. And then you criminalize activity to support them. It's just outrageous, actually.
Okay. Uh, Before now, people have always I voted already, and millions of other Americans have already voted or tried to vote. Uh, this is an opportunity, first of all, for you to talk about if a voter is having trouble, how do they contact you to ask for help?
Right. So we have the Election Protection Coalition, which the Lawyers Committee convenes. We have a suite of toll-free numbers to help voters. The 866 Hour Vote is the number that's administered by the Lawyers Committee. We have trained volunteers who answer calls live to answer any questions you may have. And it's really particularly important for voters if they have any question about voting, want to make sure that they're registered and still on the rolls in light of voting challenges. Call the hotline. We can provide that information. If you have any problems, call the hotline because we work with election officials to fix those problems as well.
Okay, now let me ask you this question. Have you had a lot, have a- have a lot of people had troubles voting early, or is it been pretty smooth so far?
Well, people have been calling with questions, concerns about not having received their absentee ballot yet, and we've been following up and helping them with that. As voters start with early voting, there's some voters who call to express that they're a bit they didn't find their polling place to be a friendly environment because of poll watchers who were, being um, not disruptive exactly, but just their presence there is not welcomed as they're looking over the shoulders of voters as they vote. But overall, I think voters are feeling very energized and determined to make their voices heard this cycle.
Okay. We're going to take a short break now to give our radio listeners a little rest and recreation, but we are going to continue with the discussion on Twitter and Facebook with our guest in this half hour, Marcia Johnson-Blanco, who is the co-director of the Lawyers Committee's Voting Rights Project. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon right after this quick break for our radio listeners. But everybody else, keep going.
I want to get back to seeing my grandbabies every Sunday and smothering them with big hugs and kisses.
I want to get back to football.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. It's only 8 days until midterm elections. Millions of Americans have already voted. Our guest in this half hour is Marcia Johnson-Blanco, who is the co-director of the Lawyers Committee Voting Rights Project. Let me ask you. You brought up something before we went to break about voters feel uncomfortable. I read about this horrible thing, I think it was in Arizona, where there are masked guards in Arizona at voting places trying to, I assume, trying to intimidate people. Is that really happening? Is it still happening?
Well, I don't think it's happening to the extent it was earlier. Yes, they have, what I would term as these vigilantes at ballot boxes, looking at how voters are casting their absentee ballots. And there seems, we're just inundated with these false narratives about the insecurity of our voting systems. And these folks have taken upon themselves that they're going to stand vigil over our voting systems to make sure the wrong person doesn't vote. How they determine that is questionable. But we have been, our partners in Arizona, for example, have been following up with election officials to make sure that voters feel comfortable using drop boxes. We've seen in Georgia, some have tried to challenge the votes of tens of thousands of voters in Gwinnett County, for example, that election officials have pushed back. And so we do have these folks who are determined to make it uncomfortable for voters to cast a ballot. At the same time, we see some of these legislatures that are making it harder for voters to cast their ballot. But within our communities, we have partners who are working with election officials to push back on those attempts and make sure that voters can have their voices heard when they show up to vote.
Okay. And let me ask you this question. Uh, You said the early voting is going well. Lots of people are voting. Do you think people are voting early at the same level they did in 2020 or more or less? What's your estimate?
From what I understand, it's on track for early voting in 2018. I mean, there's always this drop off during the midterms as
Yep.
compared to the presidential elections. But, in 2018, we had this historic turnout for a midterm. And then in 2020, we had the historic turnout for the presidential. And I'm just hoping that we keep that trend moving for 2022. And so far, it's looking really good. So it's very exciting that people want to make sure that their voices are heard, particularly given, the challenges we're facing as a country.
Okay. We're going to take another quick break to bring back our radio listeners. Our guest in this half hour is Marcia Johnson Blanco, who is the co director of the Lawyers Committee's Voting Rights Project. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC right after this. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Marcia Johnson Blanco, who is the co-director of the Lawyers Committee's Voting Rights Project. We're talking about early voting, access to voting. By the way, for our radio listeners, if you'd like to see us as well as listen to us, you can watch us on twitter.com/Brad Bannon or on facebook.com/Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos. Okay, Marcia, let me ask this. Do you expect, I've read about all sorts of threats on election day, trying to stop people from voting or God knows what else. Do you expect any major threats and blockades to people voting on Election Day on November 8th?
I don't expect it, but I'm prepared for it. I mean, there's a lot of reporting going on about people who are planning to, monitor voting. And as, we talked about before with Arizona and people already showing up at ballot boxes. So it is likely that they'll come out there. What I've seen in the past is that there's been a lot of narrative before election day or threats before election day about people who are going to threaten voters, but they don't show up. And I think the goal there is just for voters to feel uneasy and maybe not go to the polls. So I would say to voters, in spite of what you're hearing about folks who may show up at the polling place to question you or threaten you, you shouldn't let that deter you from going to vote because there are resources available to help you. We've been talking to election officials about having a plan to make sure that they are can protect these voters. The Department of Justice, please forgive my dog. The Department of Justice is going to have monitors out at polling places, so voters should not feel deterred by these reports of folks being out there questioning their vote, because I think their plan is to make you feel unsafe about going and maybe not going to vote, and we want to make sure that we don't fall into that trap as well.
Okay, let me ask you one last question about early voting before we talk about Election Day. What kinds of people vote early? Are there any demographic patterns that we should be aware of?
Yes, I mean, we do see that people who have to work on election day, our election day is not a holiday, right? It's a working day. So for people who have to work and don't have the flexibility to show up on election day, they really enjoy the convenience of early voting or voting by mail, because that way they can be sure that they can cast their ballot. People who like to sit with the ballot and research and make sure that they know who the candidates are and can vote very knowledgeably, like the convenience of voting earlier by absentee. And again, it comes down to having the opportunities available to you to vote in the way that works best for you.
Okay. Uh, let's try this. In 2018 and in 2020, I remember on election night seeing news stories about very long lines, people having to wait for hours before they could vote. And it seemed to me a lot of these, if you looked at those long lines on the network coverage of the election, a lot of the people in those lines were people, African Americans, especially. Are we likely to see that again?
Yeah, I mean, there's some, people, particularly in the African American community, who feel very strongly about voting in person, particularly because the right to vote has been such a hard fought right. And being able to show up and vote in person is very important to them, and that sense of community that comes with that. But you mentioned the really long lines, and what that speaks to is that often in communities of color, there are not enough voting equipment available for people to be able to vote, to get in and out quickly, or the machines may have broken down, or there's something that is contributing to that really long line. And so we do see, this tendency among African American voters of wanting to vote in person, but then that is also confronted by not necessarily having sufficient resources, voting equipment, and that's resulting in the long lines as well.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Besides helping, during this, election, season, helping people make sure they get to vote. You have supported the Lawyers Committee has supported a long list of reforms to make voting easier. Could you talk about some of those proposals and why they're so important?
Right. So, first and foremost, we need to restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court really weakened the reach of the Voting Rights Act. And regarding, jurisdictions with a history of discrimination that had to submit their voting changes for federal review. And since that decision, we've seen those jurisdictions, Georgia and Texas, for example, that are making it harder for voters, particularly voters of color, to cast a ballot. So we really need to get the Voting Rights Act strengthened. We really need to make it more convenient for voters, such as early voting and absentee voting standards across the country. And we also need to pass the Electoral Count Act to make sure that we don't have those who are trying to undermine the results of elections in
And I hope
2024.
you're successful because this is very important. Thanks very much for joining us, Marcia. Our guest in this half hour talking about voting rights was Marcia Johnson-Blanco, co-director of the Lawyers Project Voting Rights Project. Thank you very much, Marcia.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Right now, our country feels divided, but there's a place where people are coming together.
I gotta tell you, I was nervous to talk to someone so different than me.
Me too, but I'm glad we are.
Love Has No Labels and One Small Step are helping people with different political views, beliefs, and life experiences come together through conversation, and it feels good.
Wow, your story is so...
Interesting?
Yeah.
When people actually sit down, talk, and listen to one another, they can break down boundaries and connect as human beings. At lovehasnolabels.com/one small step, you can listen to amazing, life-changing conversations and find simple tools to start a conversation of your own.
I know one thing. This conversation gives me hope.
It gives me a lot of hope too.
Take a step toward bringing our country and your community together by having the courage to start a conversation at lovehasnolabels.com/one small step. A message from StoryCorps, Love Has No Labels, and the Ad Council.
How about Ron DeSantis? The Florida governor is the new darling of the right-wing media, funders, and other establishment powers who are pushing him to be your next president. Ron DeSantis is the new Republican Party, gushed one arch-conservative media maven. That's odd, since what characterizes Ron's tenure and is causing a collective swoon for him within the rightist hierarchy is his big government authoritarianism. Only recently, these same so-called conservatives said such use of government power was evil. But here comes DeSantis, who puts the bull in bullying, bellowing culture war hooey, demonizing immigrants, fabricating claims of voter fraud, promoting COVID lives, and so forth. Then he imperiously asserts government power to bully local communities, workers, the poor, Florida's environment, truth, fairness, honesty, and democracy. Consider one of his recent maneuvers to overturn the people's democratic will. Like most other Republican-run states, DeSantis' Florida keeps trying to block African Americans from the polls. In 2018, however, Floridians themselves rebuked the suppressors by approving a ballot measure to expand the electorate. A whopping 65% said yes to eliminating a vindictive lifelong ban on voting by ex-felons, people who had served their time. This long overdue measure of simple justice re-enfranchised about 1.4 million former felons. But wait.
Welcome back to more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon. This half hour is brought to you by my political polling company, which conducts surveys for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. Our guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, who is chairman of Sonecon, an economic advisory firm. He's also a senior fellow at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He is an internationally known economist who has advised several prominent national Democrats in economic policy. He was, in the Clinton administration, the Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs. We have Rob here today because he's the author on a new essay on the Democratic failure to capitalize on Joe Biden's economic success before the midterm election. If you want to read the essay, you can go to Dr. Shapiro's website, which is www.sonecon.com. His Twitter handle, Dr. Shapiro's Twitter handle, is Rob Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
It's a pleasure to be here again, Brad.
Okay, let's. I wanted you on to talk about your essay. With this, basically the subject of the essay is that you think Democrats are making a mistake, not standing up for and shouting from the rooftops about Joe Biden's economic successes. Why don't you talk about your essay?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Brad. The Republicans have maintained a meme for the last month or so, which is that the economy is terrible and Americans are much worse off under President Biden and the Democrats. And the main response of the Democrats has been to kind of mumble an apology about inflation, and inflation they didn't cause, and then try to change the subject. Well, that never works. The economy is, every national election is a platform to express people's either satisfaction or disappointment with the economy.
Now,
Uh,
at this point, I'll remind our viewers of James Carville, famous axiom: "It's the economy, stupid."
yes. And but the remarkable thing here is that the Democrats have a very strong economic message. They just haven't been saying it. And I think we can distill it to three basic talking points. We start with jobs, which is an issue that somehow Republicans never mention. The word never comes
No, they never do.
across the lips of any Republican candidate. So here's the talking point. Over the 21 months that Biden and Democrats have run Washington, the economy has created 10 million new jobs. 10 million. That's a monthly average of almost 480,000 jobs on average per month for 21 months. And if we compare it to the Trump record over the first 21 months of his term, it's about 300,000 jobs per month higher. So there is this really remarkable record on jobs. The second talking point has to do with wealth. You know, the Federal Reserve measures the net assets of households by income group. And the net assets are the value of your house, less your mortgage, your pension, any pension assets you have, any savings, any stocks and bonds, less other debts. And what it shows is that in the first 7 quarters of the Biden administration, not only have there been very large increases in net wealth, but the biggest percentage increases are happening at the bottom of the income ladder at the top. Now, I analyzed the data, and it showed that the bottom 20% of households, their wealth, their net assets had increased by almost $40,000 over less than 2 years, and that's after inflation. The next 40% of households increased an average of almost $36,000 per household, again after inflation. So how did it happen? It's the paychecks from 10 million new jobs. It's the administration's pandemic relief, the checks that were sent out, and it's elevated saving rates. Now, richer Americans have done well too, and their net assets went up in dollar terms more than lower income people. But really, for the first time in my memory, and I'm pretty old, the wealth of households, the wealth of households with relatively less income grew much faster than the wealth of higher income counterparts. In the bottom 20%, net wealth jumped 36%. The next 20%, it jumped 17%. The middle 20%, it jumped 12%. And at the top, it jumped by about 5%, except for the top 1%, their wealth went up 2%. So we have a economy that has generated not only jobs, but wealth, and wealth which is favoring, for the first time in living memory, people with less income. Now, so that's the second talking point. Everybody got richer.
That's a good
and then
talking
we've
point.
got a third. It is a good talking point, and yet I never hear Democratic candidates saying it.
Okay. What's the third? What's the third talking point?
Well, the third talking point, we have to address the vulnerability of Democrats, and that's inflation. And so what I did was I looked at all wage and salary income and divided it by the number of people earning wages and salaries at the beginning of the administration and 21 months in. And before inflation, the total, all wages and salaries, the total went up over 14%. Part of that is the additional people working. So we take account of rising employment, and average wage and salary income rose about $5,000 per working person, about 7.3%. Well, the GDP deflator, which is the best measure we have of inflation, that went up 8.3%. So there is a loss. Most of that inflation came unexpectedly from OPEC and the supply chain shortages and other snarls left over from the pandemic. But as an economist, dealing with all of these shocks to the economy and still having wages and salaries nearly keep up with this unexpected inflation is a big deal. Now, the difference between what the average person's wages and salaries would have to be in order to exactly keep pace with inflation and what we actually got is a little under $700. That's less than 1%. And it's offset by these very large increases in wealth. And so this is a perfectly respectable record.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there, Dr. Shapiro, because we have to go to take a short break for our radio listeners, but we will continue with our live stream listeners on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Our guest is Dr. Robert Shapiro, chairman of Sonecon, and an internationally noted economist.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes you just gotta hold on.
Okay, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, chairman of Sonecon, which is an international economic advisory firm. Rob was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs during the Clinton administration, and he continues to advise prominent Democrats. Okay, Rob, in the first segment, you talked about the good things that are happening to the economy under Joe Biden. My question to you is, if the economy is so good, why are people feeling so bad about it? And let me give you an example. I have looked at a couple of national polls in the last couple of days, and in both of them, about 2 out of every 3 voters think the country's in recession. So if the economy is so good, why are people feeling so bad?
Okay, it's a very good question, Brad. Part of it is, the greatest achievement of this administration has been its jobs record, the 10 million new jobs, and which drives growth and it drives incomes. But most people were already employed, so they don't feel a direct benefit from those 10 million new jobs. I think that's part of what's happening here. And part of the other thing that's happening here is that this inflation is a very interesting inflation. It's very uneven across goods and services. And it is by far highest in energy goods. And that's because it was driven largely, about 2/3 of it can be attributed to OPEC. and the Ukraine and the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on global oil markets. And so consequently, you have these large increases in energy, and you have increases in energy intensive goods. That is goods that require a lot of energy both to produce and to transport. And what is that? That's food. That's why you have the rising cost of food. And so people remember what they paid for milk and bread a year ago. And so I think it's people don't feel good because their most common purchases have become much more expensive, significantly more expensive, as opposed to most services, for example. Doctors' charges are not up. They're up like 1%. Dental charges are up like 2%. Education costs are up very, very little. So health and education, which we used to think of as really driving forces in inflation, and with the biggest increases, they're actually not rising because they're not energy intensive. Pharmaceutical prices are up 2%. And that's again because it doesn't take a lot of energy to produce it.
Okay, we're going to bring back our radio listeners now. And again, our guest in this segment is Dr. Robert Shapiro, chairman of Sonecon and an internationally renowned economic advisor. We'll be back with more of this. Welcome back to our radio listeners. This is Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. By the way, again, to our radio listeners, if you'd like to watch us as well as listen to us, you can see us on twitter.com/Brad Bannon. You can also view the show on facebook.com/Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos, and also on YouTube. So there's no excuse for watching us as well as listening to us. Our guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, chairman of Sonecon, which is an international economic advisory firm. Dr. Shapiro was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs during the Clinton administration, and we're welcoming him here to Deadline DC today to talk about the impact of the economy on the midterm elections, which occur in only 8 days. Dr. Shapiro, let me ask you this question. You've made a pretty good case that the economy has made all sorts of improvement under the Biden administration. My question is, why have Democrats and the Biden administration been so reluctant to talk about it?
Well, I honestly think it's they've been intimidated by the Republican attacks on inflation. And they didn't respond and say, look, this is an inflation. President started to do this and then stopped. This is an inflation being driven by Saudi Arabia and Russia. And I think that they just haven't gotten their act together to figure out that even if they don't take on inflation, which I think they could take on, they could still talk about 10 million new jobs. They could still talk about rising wealth across incomes. We also, last week, we got GDP for the third quarter. Um,
2% plus increase, right?
2.6% increase. The Republicans were saying we were in a recession. Well,
most voters think that we are, so.
The data say no. But here's another talking point. In the first 7 quarters of the Biden administration, economic growth has averaged 3.3%. 3.3%. That's a very good number. Compare that to the first 21 months of the Trump administration, when it averaged, I think, 2.3%. Or let me just check it. It averaged 2.8%. So the fact is that for the first 7 quarters of the Biden administration, economic growth has been much stronger on average than it was in the first 7 quarters of the Trump administration. Now, why Democrats don't put Republicans on the defensive on this, why they don't attack and say, look, we have a stronger growing economy than Trump produced before the pandemic. We have much stronger gains in wealth across the board than Republicans produced when they ran all of Washington in 2017 and 2018. We're creating an average of 300,000 more jobs per month for 21 months than Trump could create. Now, why they don't attack the Republican record and say, look, our record is better. And by every objective measure, it is, with the exception of inflation, but an inflation that came from Saudi Arabia and Russia, not from the policies of this administration. So look, I'm an economist and not a political message guy. Is all I can do is give the message people the data and say, here's what you can say, and it will be true. It's what the Bureau of Economic Analysis reports, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports, what the Federal Reserve reports. This isn't my view of the data. This simply is the data. This is what's happened in the economy. They should have been on the attack for the last 6 months on the economy. I honestly, as I say, I'm an economist, and it's sometimes hard for me to understand what politicians are thinking. You would have a much better idea of that than I would, Brad, because you deal with them all the time. You're giving them polls, surveys. But this is, Lenin once said that the power is lying in the streets. You just have to pick it up. Famous phrase from Lenin. Well, the case was just lying in the street. All you had to do was pick it up.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this question. What do you see happening in the economy next year? At least what I read, all sorts of, concerns about a real recession as opposed to the recession that the voters feel is already going on. What's your prognosis for the economy in the next year?
I think we're going to see much slower growth next year. And this is a direct result of the interest rate policies of the Fed. It is the main tool we have to try to bring down inflation. You bring down inflation in this respect by making it harder for people to spend large amounts of money. So things you have to borrow money for. Interest rates are higher, fewer people are buying houses, fewer people will buy cars, fewer people will take out more credit card debt. That slows the economy. As demand falls, it comes more in line with supply and no longer puts pressure on prices. So I think next year what we're going to see is inflation easing to about 4 to 4.5%. And we're going to see the economy either growing maybe 1 to 1.5%, or if the Fed overcompensates and raises rates too much too quickly, we could see a short recession. It will break the inflation. And frankly, I think 2024 will be a good year for the economy.
Which is good for President Biden because he has to run for re-election in 2024.
Right.
So what can the administration do if the growth is going to slow, people are going to get more frustrated and angry? What can the Biden administration do to soften this situation next year?
Well, we can, if unemployment begins to rise, we can have generous unemployment benefits that will ease some of this. We're easing the debt burdens of young people through the student loan forgiveness program. And, I think the administration, if Republicans take control of the House.
Okay, Dr. Shapiro, unfortunately, I have to cut you off there because we are out of time. I want to thank Dr. Shapiro, chairman of Sonecon, an economic advisory firm, and our guest in the first segment, Marcia Johnson-Blanco, who discussed voting rights. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC next Monday at 3 p.m. live.